3,000 meters below the surface of the Weddell Sea, in a darkness that no natural light has ever touched. A wooden ship rests upright on the seafloor, her masts still reaching toward a sky she will never see again. Her timbers, though scarred by the ice that once crushed them, hold their shape with a clarity that seems almost impossible. The ship's name is still visible across her stern, the paint faded but legible, spelling out a single word that has echoed through more than a century of polar history: endurance. She went down in the autumn of 1915, swallowed by pack ice that had held her fast for months before finally breaking her apart. And there she remained, undisturbed, for 107 years, until a team of searchers found her in the year 2022, sitting so precisely upright on the silted floor of the sea that she seemed, in the first photographs, almost ready to sail on. This is the quiet wonder at the center of her story. Not merely that she was lost, but that she could be found at all, and found in such extraordinary condition. Ships that sink in ice-choked, freezing waters rarely survive as more than scattered fragments, timbers pulled apart by current and time, iron eaten away by decades of salt. Yet endurance had settled into a kind of stillness that the ocean rarely grants. The cold of the Weddell Sea, so hostile to the men who once depended on her, became in the end her preservation. The same waters that crushed her hull between two slabs of pack ice also sealed her from the wood-boring organisms that reduce most wrecks to rubble within a matter of decades. She sank into a depth so profound and a cold so unrelenting that time itself seemed to slow around her. When the search team's cameras finally reached her, deck timbers still held their form. The ship's wheel remained upright at the stern. Even the word endurance, carved and painted by hands that had vanished from the earth decades before, still caught the light of the submersible's lamps. To understand how such a thing could happen, how a ship destroyed by ice in 1915 could be discovered whole in the 21st century, is to step back into an age when the polar regions represented the last truly unmapped corners of the world. By the early years of the 20th century, explorers had reached the summit of nearly every mountain within reach and charted nearly every coastline that mattered to the great trading nations. But the poles remained different. They were vast, blank spaces on the map. Regions where the ordinary rules of geography seemed to falter, where compasses behaved strangely and the sun itself might not set for months at a time. To reach the poles was to accomplish something that no explorer before had managed. And in the years just before the First World War, a fierce, almost feverish contest had developed among the nations of Europe to be first. First to the North Pole, first to the South, first to cross the last of the unclaimed white spaces on the globe. This was the era into which endurance was born, though she was not built for war, nor for trade, nor even originally for the man who would make her famous. She began her life in a Norwegian shipyard, constructed with a purpose that had nothing to do with the ambitions of the British Empire. Her earliest name was Polaris, and she was built to carry wealthy tourists on polar bear hunting expeditions into the Arctic regions near Spitsbergen, a use that seems almost quaint set against the story that would eventually claim her. She was built with extraordinary care, her hull constructed from oak and Norwegian fir in layers nearly 2.5 feet thick in places. Her frame reinforced far beyond what an ordinary vessel of her size would require. The shipwrights who built her understood that she would need to withstand pressure, that few ships were ever asked to endure, though even they could not have imagined the pressure that would eventually be asked of her. It was this reputation for strength that drew the attention of a British explorer named Ernest Shackleton, a man already well known in the world of polar exploration by the time he encountered her. Shackleton had sailed south before, had come close to the South Pole only to be turned back. and had watched with a mixture of admiration and quiet ambition as a Norwegian rival succeeded where he had failed. By the time Polaris came into his view, the South Pole itself had already been reached, first by Roald Amundsen, then by Robert Falcon Scott, whose own expedition had ended in tragedy on the ice. With the pole itself already claimed, Shackleton set his sights on something almost as audacious: the first crossing of the entire Antarctic continent, from one coast to the other, passing directly through the pole along the way. It was an expedition that would require a ship capable of pushing deep into pack ice that had defeated other vessels. And it was for this purpose that Shackleton acquired the Norwegian ship, renamed her, and gave her a name drawn from his own family motto: Fortitudine Vincimus, by endurance we conquer. The ship became Endurance, and in her, Shackleton placed both his ambitions and, though he could not have known it then, the fate of every man who would eventually sail with her. The era that produced this expedition has often been called the last great age of polar exploration, and the name carries a certain wistful truth. It was an age when reaching the ends of the earth still required wooden ships and sled dogs, wool clothing and hand-drawn charts, when survival in the polar regions depended almost entirely on human endurance rather than mechanical power. It was also an age shaped by the ambitions of empires as much as individuals. Nations invested prestige, and sometimes considerable sums of money, into expeditions that promised to plant a flag where no flag had been planted before. Explorers themselves were often driven by a complicated mixture of national pride, personal glory, scientific curiosity, and something harder to name: a simple, magnetic pull toward the blank spaces on the map, a need to know what lay beyond the edge of the known world. Shackleton embodied this mixture perhaps more completely than any explorer of his generation. He was neither the first to the pole, nor, in the end, entirely successful in his own great ambition. But he possessed a quality that would come to define his legacy far more than any single achievement: an unshakable commitment to bringing every one of his men home alive, whatever the cost to his own ambitions. It is this combination, the ship, the age, the man, and the disaster that would soon unfold, that makes the discovery beneath the Weddell Sea so quietly extraordinary. When the wreck was finally located in 2022, it was not merely a piece of maritime archaeology that had been recovered. It was a physical link to an age whose ambitions and hardships can otherwise feel abstract, softened by the passage of more than 100 years. To see Endurance resting upright on the seafloor, her wheel still standing, her name still visible across her stern, is to be reminded that history is not only a matter of documents and photographs, but of objects that endure, quite literally, long after the world that made them has vanished. The wooden hull holds within it not only the ice that crushed it, but the entire vanished age of polar ambition that sent her south in the first place. What follows is the story of how she came to lie there, 3,000 meters beneath the waves. The voyage that carried her into the Weddell Sea, the ice that closed around her hull like a slow and patient predator, and the extraordinary chain of events that followed her loss, ending not in tragedy, but in one of the most remarkable survival stories in the history of exploration. It is a story of ambition and endurance in equal measure, of a ship built to withstand pressure beyond ordinary limits, and of a crew who would come to embody the very motto that gave her name. If you would like to settle in for the whole of it, from her construction in a quiet Norwegian shipyard to the astonishing moment her hull reappeared in the glow of underwater cameras a century later, consider subscribing to the channel so that the rest of her story might find you when it is ready to be told. By the time the Endurance was laid down, the world's fascination with the polar regions had already reached a kind of fever pitch, though it was a fever of a particular, restrained sort. an ambition dressed in the language of science and empire, but driven, underneath, by something closer to longing. For the better part of a decade, the two poles of the Earth had stood as the last great blank spaces on the map. The final places where a man might go and be the first, where nothing had come before him but ice and silence. The Arctic had been chased and half-claimed for generations, but it was the far south, the white continent that few had seen and fewer still had crossed, that had become the last true prize of what would later be called the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. It was an age that had begun in earnest at the turn of the century, with ships pressing south under sail and steam alike, their holds filled with instruments and tinned meat, and an almost religious faith in the idea that a nation's character could be measured by what its men were willing to endure. By the time Shackleton commissioned the ship that would become the Endurance, that age was drawing, though no one yet knew it, toward its close. The great races had already been run. In the closing months of 1911 and the opening days of 1912, two expeditions had converged upon the South Pole from different directions and with very different outcomes. And the story of that convergence had already passed into legend by the time the Endurance's keel was laid. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian, had reached the pole first in December of 1911, arriving with a calm and terrible efficiency that left little room for drama. Dogs well managed, distances well calculated, a flag raised, and a camp struck with the quiet satisfaction of a job done exactly as planned. Robert Falcon Scott, the Englishman, had reached the same point some 5 weeks later, only to find Amundsen's tent already standing in the snow, and the news of his failure would have been hard enough to bear on its own. But Scott and his 4 companions had not survived the return journey. They had died in their tent, some 11 miles short of a supply depot that might have saved them. And when their bodies and their diaries were found the following spring, the account of their final weeks had swept across Britain and the wider world with the force of a national tragedy. Scott's death, more than his defeat, had become the defining image of the age. Noble, sorrowful, wrapped in the particular grief of a nation that had wanted its heroes to win, but found, in losing, something it could mourn just as deeply. Shackleton had watched all of this unfold from close quarters, for he was no newcomer to the ice himself. He had sailed south for the first time in 1901 as a young officer aboard Scott's own Discovery expedition, and had been sent home early, invalided by scurvy and exhaustion, in what he had always regarded as a private humiliation rather than a medical necessity. He had returned to the Antarctic in command of his own expedition in 1907, aboard a small and aging ship called the Nimrod, and had come astonishingly close to the pole itself, turning back only 97 miles short of it, a decision that had cost him the glory of being first, but had very likely saved the lives of his party. He was fond, in later years, of a line that captured the choice precisely, that he would rather be a live donkey than a dead lion. And though the phrasing was his own particular brand of self-deprecating wit, it revealed something true about the man beneath the fame. He was ambitious to the point of restlessness, driven by a hunger for distinction that never quite left him satisfied. And yet he possessed, in equal measure, a caution about the lives of the men who followed him, that made him, in the eyes of those who served under him, something closer to trustworthy than merely brave. It was this combination that had built his reputation by the time the Endurance was ordered. Not the reputation of a man who had planted a flag first, for he had not, but the reputation of a man who had brought his people home. Where Scott's legend had been built on a heroic death, Shackleton's had been built, and would be built again, on survival. He had a gift for it that seemed almost instinctive, a capacity to read the mood of a camp or a crew, and to say the right thing at the right moment, to make hardship feel, for a little while, like adventure rather than suffering. Those who sailed with him spoke of a kind of magnetism that was difficult to describe on paper. Not the polished charm of an aristocrat, for he had been born to modest means in Ireland and had made his own way in the world through the merchant marine. But something warmer and rougher, a way of making each man feel that his particular contribution mattered to the whole. He drank in moderation, gambled more than he should have, and was chronically, almost comically bad with money, forever chasing the next scheme that might fund the next expedition. But on the ice, whatever his failings elsewhere, he seemed to become exactly the man his crews needed him to be. By 1913, however, Shackleton faced a genuine problem, one that had nothing to do with ice or storms and everything to do with the calendar. The South Pole had been reached, not once but twice, and reached by other men. The obvious prize was gone. And yet the continent itself, the vast frozen mass beneath the pole, remained in many ways as unknown as it had ever been. Its interior, a blank space larger than Europe, crossed by no one, mapped only at its edges where ships had managed to press against the pack ice and put men briefly ashore. If the pole itself could no longer be claimed for the first time, there remained 1 feet of comparable scale that had not yet been attempted, let alone achieved: a complete crossing of the Antarctic continent, coast to coast, through the pole itself, a journey of some 1,800 miles across terrain that no expedition had ever traversed, and that no one could say with certainty was even survivable. It was to this idea that Shackleton now turned his restless attention, and he did so with the particular energy of a man who has found, in the nick of time, a reason to go on doing the only thing he had ever really wanted to do. The plan, once it began to take shape, was audacious even by the standards of an age that prized audacity. 2 ships would be needed, sailing from opposite sides of the continent. One party would land on the shore of the Weddell Sea, in the region that lay roughly beneath South America, and would strike out across the ice toward the pole. A second party would sail into the Ross Sea, on the far side of the continent nearer to New Zealand and Australia, and would lay a series of supply depots along the final stretch of the crossing route, so that the men coming from the Weddell Sea, exhausted and running low on provisions after traversing the pole itself, would find food and fuel waiting for them at intervals as they made their way down to the coast. It was a plan that depended on the precise coordination of 2 expeditions separated by an entire continent and thousands of miles of open ocean, communicating by nothing more reliable than the hope that both parties would keep faith with a schedule set more than a year in advance. Shackleton named it, with characteristic grandiosity and a genuine sense of what was at stake, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. And he began, through the early months of 1914, to gather the money, the men, and the ships that such an undertaking would require. It was a plan built as much on faith as on calculation, and it would demand of its ships and its men a level of endurance that few polar expeditions before it had ever truly tested. For the interior crossing alone, had it been achieved, would have stood as one of the great feats of exploration in any age. Shackleton, characteristically, seemed to regard the scale of the difficulty less as a deterrent than as the whole point. He had spent a decade proving that he could bring men home from disaster. Now he set out to prove that he could lead them across a continent no one had ever crossed at all. And for that, he would need a ship equal to the ambition, a vessel built not for comfort or speed, but for survival against the one force that had ended so many polar voyages before hers: the ice itself. Before she bore the name Endurance, before Shackleton had ever laid eyes on her, she was known simply as Polaris, and she was built for a purpose far removed from the crossing of a continent. Her story began not in London or in the offices of the Royal Geographical Society, but in the small Norwegian town of Sandefjord, on the country's southern coast. a place whose name was bound up entirely with ships and ice. Sandefjord, in the early years of the 20th century, was a whaling town, its harbour crowded with vessels built to hunt in the cold waters of the Arctic and, increasingly, the Antarctic, and its shipyards among the most accomplished in the world at building hulls that could survive where ordinary ships could not. It was here, at the Framnes Mekaniske Verksted, the Framnes Yard, that the vessel who would later be called Endurance was laid down, and it was here that the specific genius of her construction was first conceived. She was not built for exploration in the sense that later made her famous. Her intended purpose, at least on paper, was tourism and hunting. A vessel to carry wealthy patrons to the edge of the polar world, to the fjords and ice fields of Spitsbergen and the Arctic North, where passengers might hunt polar bear and walrus in relative comfort, before returning to warmer latitudes with their trophies and their stories. This was, in the years before the First War, a genuine commercial enterprise, and a small fleet of specially strengthened vessels had begun to serve it, carrying the curious and the affluent into waters that a generation before had been the exclusive province of whalers and naval expeditions. Polaris was conceived as one of the finest of these vessels, a ship built to a standard of strength that pleasure craft rarely required, because her owners understood, as the Framnes Yard understood, that no amount of luxury mattered if the ship herself could not survive contact with the ice she was built to approach. The man responsible for her design was Ole Anderud Larsen, working in close consultation with the yard's most experienced builders. And the commission came from a Belgian financier and polar enthusiast named Lars Christensen, whose ambitions for Arctic tourism required a vessel unlike any then in commercial service. What Christensen wanted, and what Larsen set himself to provide, was a ship whose hull would not merely tolerate an encounter with pack ice, but would be built from the outset to withstand the particular, grinding, relentless pressure that ice exerts upon a wooden hull. A pressure unlike anything encountered in open water, more a slow crushing than a sudden blow, more a test of endurance than of impact. This was the unusual specification that shaped every subsequent decision in her construction. Not merely a strong ship, but a ship whose entire design logic proceeded from the assumption that she would, at some point, be surrounded by ice and would need to survive the embrace. The construction itself, carried out through 1912 and into the early months of 1914, was regarded even at the time as a work of unusual and deliberate care. The keel and the principal structural timbers were oak, cut from trees, selected specifically for their density and the straightness of their grain. And the yard's carpenters were said to have rejected timber that other builders would have accepted without hesitation. But it was in the choice of greenheart, a timber imported from the forests of Guyana, that the ship's builders made their most consequential decision. Greenheart is a wood so dense that it does not float, so hard that ordinary tools blunt themselves against it, and so resistant to decay and to the boring of marine worms that it was already prized, by the early 20th century, for the construction of docks, piers, and the sheathing of ships meant to face the harshest conditions afloat. It was, in the plain language of shipwrights, iron hard, a timber that yielded only reluctantly to axe or saw, and that once shaped and fitted, held its form against pressures that would have splintered oak alone. The hull that resulted from this combination of timbers was extraordinary in its layering. The frames, sawn from single pieces of oak, rather than built up from shorter lengths in the manner more common and more economical elsewhere, gave the ship a structural continuity that lesser hulls lacked, since a single unbroken timber resists strain differently and more evenly than a frame assembled from joined sections. Over these frames, the shipwrights laid planking of extraordinary thickness. Accounts from those who examined her at the time describe planking that in places reached more than 2.5 feet through the combined layers of her sides. An accumulation of oak and greenheart built up almost as a fortress wall is built up. Layer against layer, each course adding not merely bulk but redundancy, so that no single point of failure could easily compromise the whole. The bow, which would bear the brunt of any encounter with ice, received the most particular attention of all. Where an ordinary ship's bow was shaped to part the water efficiently, hers was built and reinforced to meet solid ice directly, sheathed in greenheart to a thickness that exceeded even the sides, backed by additional interior bracing designed to transmit the shock of contact through the whole structure of the vessel, rather than concentrating it at any single weak point. She was a ship, in other words, designed from her very keel upward around the principle that she would not avoid the ice but would go into it and would need to withstand what she found there. The shipwrights of Framnes worked by methods that were already, even in 1913, beginning to seem old-fashioned beside the iron and steel construction increasingly common elsewhere. But the choice of wood was not sentiment or economy. It was a considered judgment that a wooden hull, properly built, possessed a resilience against the specific pressures of pack ice that a rigid iron hull could not match. Since wood could flex, however slightly, and distribute strain through its grain in ways that metal, under the same crushing force, could not. Whether this judgment was correct would not be tested for several years, and when it finally was tested, it would be tested far beyond anything her original builders had ever imagined asking of her. But in the details of her construction, the selection of single-piece oak frames, the imported greenheart sheathing, the reinforced and doubled bow, the sheer patient accumulation of timber upon timber, there is a foreshadowing that later observers would find difficult not to notice. She was built quite deliberately, quite carefully, by men who understood the ice and feared it, to be a ship that could meet the one force capable of destroying her and come away whole. She was launched in December of 1912, christened Polaris in a ceremony attended by the yard's principal patrons, and for a brief time she served precisely the purpose for which she had been designed, carrying tourists and hunters into Arctic waters, where her reinforced hull allowed her captains a confidence that lesser vessels could not offer. But the venture that had commissioned her did not endure long in its original form. The economics of polar tourism proved less reliable than the timbers that had gone into her hull, and within a few years of her launch, Polaris found herself without the purpose for which she had been built, a ship of extraordinary and deliberate strength, standing idle, or nearly so, while the world that might have used her turned its attention elsewhere, toward a war gathering in Europe that would consume ships, men, and ambitions on a scale that made polar tourism seem a small and distant concern. It was in these circumstances, a magnificent hull without a mission, a ship built for the ice with no one left to send her there, that she came, by a chain of negotiation and circumstance, to the attention of a British explorer who required precisely what she had been built to offer, though for a purpose entirely different from the one her Norwegian builders had first intended. The ship that had been raised at Framnes to carry hunters among the icebergs of Spitsbergen was about to be asked to do something else altogether, to carry a crossing of a continent no one had ever crossed, and to serve, in the process, as the last and most severe proof of whether her builders' faith in oak and greenheart had been justified. The purchase itself was conducted with the same mixture of ambition and improvisation that had marked so much of the enterprise around her. Sir Ernest Shackleton, having conceived of an imperial trans-Antarctic expedition that would attempt to cross the continent from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea by way of the pole, needed a ship capable of forcing a passage through pack ice, thick enough to have turned back lesser vessels, and strong enough to withstand a season or more beset. If beset, she became. Polaris, sitting still in her builder's yard, unsold and unclaimed by the Belgian prince for whom she had been intended, was very nearly perfect for the purpose, and Shackleton's agents moved to acquire her in the year 1914, before the keel of any purpose-built rival could be laid down. The price paid is recorded variously in the surviving accounts, but the sum was substantial, drawn from the patchwork of subscriptions, private donations, and one crucial late gift that had kept the expedition's finances from collapsing before it had properly begun. What mattered, in the end, was not the figure, but the transfer itself, the moment at which a ship built for one man's hunting ambitions passed into the hands of another man's continental ones. With the purchase came the renaming, and it is here that the historical record allows a moment of quiet reflection. For the choice of name was neither arbitrary nor commercial, as so many ship names of the era were, but personal, drawn from the motto of Shackleton's own family. Fortitudine vincimus, by endurance we conquer. The word itself, endurance, was lifted whole from that Latin phrase and set upon the ship's stern in plain lettering, without ornament, without further explanation offered in the accounts that survive. It is worth noting calmly how apt the word would prove, though no one standing on the quay in those months could have known the full weight the name would eventually carry. Ships of the polar trade were often named for saints, for monarchs, for the wives and daughters of their patrons, or for qualities of speed and grace that owed more to hope than to naval architecture. Endurance was named for none of these oaths. She was named for a virtue that her crew would be asked, in the years just ahead, to practice in a manner far beyond what any of them could have anticipated when the letters were first painted onto her transom. The symbolism did not need embellishing then, and it does not need embellishing now. The name simply sat upon the ship, waiting, as names do, to be filled with meaning by events not yet arrived. The work of refitting her for Antarctic service occupied the months that followed the purchase, and it was neither small nor swift. Though Polaris had been built with ice already in mind, Shackleton's expedition demanded modifications suited to a far longer and more uncertain voyage than any Norwegian sealing season had required. Her interior was reconfigured to provide berths and stowage for a scientific and exploratory party far larger than a hunting crew, with cabins fitted for officers and scientists along a section that would become known, with the crew's characteristic dry humor, as the Ritz, a name applied without irony to a space that was, by any ordinary measure, cramped and spare, but which by the standards of a polar ship felt almost luxurious. Storage was arranged for the sledges, tents, and scientific instruments that a transcontinental crossing would require, along with provisions calculated to sustain the party not merely for a single Antarctic season, but for the possibility of a second, unplanned one, a precaution whose wisdom would soon reveal itself with a clarity none of the provisioners could have wished for. Sledge dogs, numbering some 60 in total, were embarked at various points along the voyage, housed in kennels built onto the upper deck, their presence adding both a source of eventual transport across the ice and a chorus of noise that the surviving crew accounts recall with evident, if weary, affection. Provisioning a ship for the Antarctic was an exercise in calculating uncertainty, and the lists that survive from this period: tinned meats, dried vegetables, sledging rations formulated for high caloric density, tobacco, medical supplies, coal for the engine, paraffin for the lamps, reflect an expedition attempting to prepare for a journey whose exact demands could not be known in advance. Coal in particular was a source of ongoing calculation, for Endurance carried both sail and a coal-fired engine, and the balance between the two, how much steam to raise, how much canvas to trust to the wind, how far the bunkers would stretch before they required replenishment at the last useful port, was a question that would recur throughout the voyage south, becoming steadily more pressing as the ship pushed further from any place where coal might be replaced. The gathering of the crew proceeded alongside this material preparation, and it is here that the surviving records allow us to name, with some confidence, the men who would share the ship's fate. Frank Worsley, a New Zealander with a long history at sea and a gift for navigation that would later prove almost providential, was appointed captain of Endurance, entrusted with the handling of the ship herself, while Shackleton retained overall command of the expedition. Worsley's own account of his selection describes an almost dreamlike sense of destiny about the appointment, though such retrospective framing should be read, as with much expedition literature written after the fact, with a calm awareness that memory reshapes itself around outcomes already known. Frank Wild, who had served with Shackleton on prior Antarctic ventures, and whose loyalty and competence were by this point well established, was named second in command, a role that would place upon him, in the months ahead, responsibilities far beyond what any contract could have specified. Other names emerge from the ship's muster and from the diaries and photographs that survive. Thomas Ord Lees, appointed motor engineer and storekeeper, whose meticulous diary would later provide historians with some of the most detailed daily records of the voyage. Frank Hurley, the Australian photographer whose images would eventually make the expedition's fate visible to the world in a way no written account alone could achieve. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, whose banjo would become, in the icebound months ahead, an object of unexpected and enduring comfort to the whole company. The crew numbered in total some 28 men, a company drawn from naval backgrounds, merchant service, science, and, in a few cases, simple, adventurous inclination, brought together under Shackleton's particular gift for assembling men who could endure one another's company, under conditions no ordinary employment would ever require. The departure from England in August of 1914 unfolded beneath circumstances that no one connected with the expedition could have arranged, and few would have wished for. Britain had entered the war against Germany only days before Endurance was due to sail, and the accounts describe a genuine uncertainty within the expedition's leadership as to whether the voyage should proceed at all, while the nation stood at the threshold of a conflict whose scale was not yet understood, but whose gravity was already evident to everyone. Shackleton is recorded as having offered the ship and the men to the Admiralty for war service, a gesture the sources describe as sincere rather than performative, and the reply, attributed in the histories to the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, in a single telegraphed word, "Proceed," released the expedition to continue as planned. The ship therefore left English waters not amid the untroubled fanfare that had marked earlier decades of polar departure, but under the shadow of a war whose opening battles were already being fought on the continent. Her crew aware, in a manner earlier expeditions had never needed to be, that the world to which they might eventually return would not be the same world they were leaving. Endurance sailed first to Plymouth, and from there onward toward Buenos Aires and the deep southern ocean beyond, carrying with her a name chosen for its private meaning. A crew assembled from disparate corners of maritime and scientific life, and a purpose that had, in the span of a single summer, become entangled with a global conflict none of her builders or her patrons could have foreseen when her keel was first laid at Framnes. What lay ahead of her, the ice, the drift, the long entrapment that would give her name its full and terrible meaning, had not yet begun. But she left England already carrying, in her very name, the quiet suggestion of what would be asked of her. The Endurance sailed from Plymouth in early August of 1914, slipping down the English Channel at the very hour that the old certainties of Europe were dissolving into war. Shackleton himself was not aboard for this first leg. He remained behind to settle the expedition's tangled finances, and to secure, in a gesture that would become one of the enduring stories of the voyage, the Admiralty's blessing to proceed, despite the guns already sounding across the continent. Frank Worsley, the New Zealand-born captain, took her out instead, and it fell to him to nurse a still unfamiliar ship and a still unfamiliar crew through the first long leg of a journey that would not end, in any real sense, for 2 more years. The plan was simple in outline, if not in execution. South to Buenos Aires, where Shackleton would rejoin her, and from there, further south still, to the whaling station at South Georgia, the last inhabited outpost before the pack ice and the unmapped water of the Weddell Sea. The Atlantic crossing gave the crew and the ship time to become acquainted with one another, and the diaries kept by several of the men, Worsley's own log chief among them, along with the more private and reflective entries of the surgeon Alexander Macklin and the meteorologist Leonard Hussey, describe a period of steady, almost domestic adjustment. The Endurance rode the ocean swells with the buoyant, rolling motion that her whaler's hull had been built to produce, a motion some men found agreeable and others did not. And there are accounts of a lively seasickness among a few of the less experienced hands in the first days out. But the ship herself drew consistent admiration. She was, by every account that survives, a vessel of unusual beauty for a working polar ship. Her Norwegian oak sheathed and braced, her lines low and purposeful, her masts rigged for the auxiliary sail that would spare her coal when the engines were not needed. Photographs taken during this leg of the voyage, many of them the work of the Australian photographer Frank Hurley, who had joined the expedition specifically for this purpose, show a ship gleaming with new paint and new rigging, her decks not yet scarred by the ice that would eventually claim her. Life aboard settled into a rhythm that combined the disciplines of a working ship with the looser, more improvisational culture of a scientific expedition. There were watches to stand, sails to trim, the engine to tend, and alongside this, the ordinary business of a research voyage. Soundings taken, specimens collected where possible, notes kept on weather and current. But it was the animals aboard that left the most vivid mark on the written record. The Endurance carried some 60 sledge dogs, purchased in Canada and brought aboard in stages, along with a ship's cat named Mrs. Chippy, who belonged, despite the name, to the ship's carpenter, Harry McNish. The dogs were housed in kennels lashed along the deck, and the diaries are full of small, affectionate notices of their individual temperaments. The fights that broke out between rival teams, the favourites that emerged among the crew, the names given to them, many of which have survived in Hurley's photographs and in the crew's own letters home. The dogs became, in the retelling of nearly every man who left an account, something closer to companions than cargo, and their presence gave the long crossing a texture of ordinary life that the men would remember with particular tenderness once the true hardship began. The scientific staff aboard, led by the biologist Robert Clark, and including the physicist Reginald James and the geologist James Wardy, conducted what work they could during the crossing. Though the more substantial research was understood by everyone to lie ahead, once the ship reached the ice and the planned overland crossing of the continent could begin. Shackleton's stated purpose for the expedition, to make the first land crossing of Antarctica, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea, required first that the Endurance succeed in her more immediate task, which was simply to reach a suitable point on the Weddell Sea coast from which the crossing party could set out. It was a purpose that depended entirely on ice conditions that no one aboard could yet judge, and it was at South Georgia, the last stop before that judgment would be tested, that the crew received their first real warning of what lay ahead. The Endurance reached Grytviken, the Norwegian whaling station on South Georgia's northern coast, in early November of 1914, and remained there for over a month, far longer than originally planned. Grytviken was, by the standards of the polar world, a place of relative civilization, a working settlement of several hundred men, with workshops, a small church, and the accumulated practical knowledge of Norwegian whalers who had spent years navigating the waters around South Georgia and, in some cases, ranging further south into the pack ice itself. It was here that Shackleton and Worsley sought out the counsel of the station's most experienced captains, men whose whole working lives had been organized around reading ice, wind, and current, and whose warnings, recorded afterward by several members of the expedition, would prove to have been entirely justified. The whalers told Shackleton that the ice that season was unusually heavy and widespread, further north than they had seen it in years, and they urged caution about attempting to push directly into the Weddell Sea as planned. Worsley's account records the substance of these warnings plainly. The pack was reported thick and extensive. The summer had been a poor one for opening water in the usual channels, and more than one experienced captain suggested that the expedition might do well to delay or to reconsider its intended route. Shackleton listened, weighed the counsel of men whose judgment he had every reason to respect, and chose, in the end, to proceed. The decision has been examined and re-examined by historians in the century since, weighed against what is known of the exceptional ice conditions of that particular Antarctic summer. Though the sources agree that Shackleton's choice was neither reckless in the manner it is sometimes portrayed, nor free of the ordinary gambler's hope that conditions might yet improve by the time the ship reached the ice edge. He had committed years and a considerable sum of borrowed money to this expedition. Delay carried its own costs, and the warnings, however grave, described a difficulty rather than an impossibility. The month at South Georgia was not spent solely on this deliberation. The crew used the time to make final repairs, to take on additional supplies, and to rest before the harder work ahead. Hurley's photographs from this period show the Endurance at anchor against the stark, glacier-carved mountains of the island, her rigging catching the low southern light, and the crew moving about her decks with the unhurried confidence of men who did not yet know how much would be asked of them. Letters written home from Grytviken, several of which survive in family collections and later published editions, carry a tone of high spirits and anticipation, the ordinary excitement of men on the edge of a genuine unknown, tempered here and there by a more sober note, as when Shackleton himself is recorded remarking to a colleague on the seriousness of the ice reports, even as he prepared to sail regardless. On the 5th of December 1914, the Endurance left South Georgia and turned her bow south, away from the last human settlement she would see, into water that grew colder and more strange with every mile. The accounts kept by nearly every man aboard mark this departure as a distinct threshold, the moment at which the expedition ceased to be a voyage in any ordinary sense, and became instead a passage into a world without ports, without other ships, without any authority beyond the ice itself and the skill of the men who had to read it. The ship that carried them was, in these final days before the trouble began, still very much the vessel her builders in Sandefjord had intended her to be. Sound in her timbers, strong in her ice sheathing, well found in her stores, and admired by every man aboard who had occasion to describe her. She met the first loose ice within days of leaving South Georgia. Scattered floes at first, easily avoided or gently pushed aside, and for a while longer the Endurance moved south through open leads of dark water with the same steady, capable grace that had carried her across the Atlantic. It was, in the retrospective judgment of nearly everyone who wrote of it afterward, the last easy sailing the ship would ever know. The ice did not arrive all at once. It came the way winter comes to a house left unheated, not as an event, but as a slow subtraction of comfort, so gradual that no single day could be pointed to as the day the trouble began. Through the middle weeks of January, the floes thickened from scattered plates into broad fields, and the leads of open water that Worsley had been threading with such patience grew narrower, then hesitant, then closed. The Endurance would push into what looked like passable ice, find give in it advance a mile, 2 miles, and then meet a barrier of pressure and consolidation that no amount of engine power could shoulder aside. She would back off, cast about, find another lead, and repeat the process, so that days of steaming produced only a handful of miles of true southward progress, and sometimes none at all. The men on watch grew used to the sound of ice grinding along the hull, a low, continuous scraping that Worsley likened to the ship walking on gravel. And Shackleton, watching the pack close from the crow's nest with his glasses, began to use a word in his diary that he had avoided until then: beset. Pack ice is not a sheet, but a mosaic, a vast broken pavement of floes of every size, from cakes no larger than a table to fields stretching to the horizon, all of it riding on the sea and none of it fixed. Wind and current move the floes independently of one another, so that a channel of black water that had stood open an hour before could close in minutes as two great plates converged, squeezing whatever lay between them. Where floe met floe under pressure, the ice did not simply crumble. It rose. Ridges of broken and refrozen blocks pushed up along the boundaries, some no higher than a man's knee, others taller than a house. Jagged white walls thrown up by forces the crew could hear but rarely see happening. A distant booming and groaning that carried for miles across the frozen plain, and that the older hands, the whalers among them, recognized at once as the sound of ice under strain. Frank Worsley, who had a navigator's patience for such things, spent hours charting the drift of individual floes against fixed points, trying to read in their slow rotation and collision some pattern that might yield a way through. There was pattern, but it was not the kind that offered passage. The whole field was drifting north and west under the pressure of wind and the great clockwise circulation of the Weddell Sea, carrying the ship with it regardless of what her engines did, so that the Endurance was in the strange position of steaming steadily toward open water while the ice beneath and around her carried her steadily away from it. The mood aboard shifted with the ice, though not evenly and not all at once. In the early days of entrapment there was still confidence, even a kind of grim good humor. This was, after all, a ship built for exactly this kind of country, and Shackleton had faced worse in his years south. The men joked about the delay, took photographs of the pressure ridges, walked out onto the floes on calm days to stretch their legs and play with the dogs, who had never seen so much snow, and ran themselves into a happy exhaustion. Hurley set up his camera in the cold, with the patient absorption of a man who understood that what surrounded him was rare and worth preserving. And some of the photographs he made in those weeks, the ship lit by a strange flat light, dwarfed by the white plain around her, carry in them no hint yet of alarm, only a kind of severe beauty. There was talk in the wardroom of the ice releasing its grip with the first strong blow from the right quarter, of steaming free within a fortnight, of reaching Varsel Bay only a little behind schedule. Worsley, checking his charts and his instruments, held privately to a more sober arithmetic, and by early February had concluded that the ship was not delayed but caught, and that the caught condition was unlikely to end before the ice itself changed with the season. That judgment proved correct, and through February the mood aboard thickened along with the ice, not into despair. That word belongs to a later stage of the story, but into an uneasy, watchful acceptance. Shackleton's diary from these weeks shows a man doing the arithmetic of endurance rather than of escape, calculating how the stores would hold, how the dogs would fare, how 300 tons of coal might be stretched across a winter that had not been part of the plan. He gave the order to stop burning coal for propulsion, since the propeller had nothing to bite and the fires were only consuming fuel that might be needed later for warmth and for the small daily tasks of a ship no longer underway. The engine room fires were banked and finally let go out, and with that, the last sound of the Endurance as a working vessel fell silent. What remained was the creak of timber, the distant grind and boom of the pack, and, increasingly, the deepening cold as the sun tracked lower with every circuit of the sky. By late February, the polar night was closing in with the same patient inevitability as the ice. The days shortened with a speed that surprised even those who had read of it beforehand, the sun swinging lower and lower along the northern horizon, until at last, some point in the transition that no one recorded with great precision, it failed to clear the horizon at all, and the ship entered a season lit only by a long grey twilight at midday and by the moon and the aurora at other hours. The men adjusted their lives to it as sailors adjust to weather. Without much comment, banking the stoves higher, rigging canvas screens against the wind that found every gap in the ship's upper works, and settling into the rhythm of watches kept more for the sake of order than because there was anything left to watch for. Shackleton, ever alert to the dangers of idle minds in confinement, organized lectures, games, a routine of exercise for the dogs and the men alike, football on the floe when the ice was calm enough to permit it, concerts on Saturday nights with Hussey's banjo carrying thin and bright across the frozen quiet. It was, by every account that survives, a company that bore its confinement with remarkable good order, and much of the credit for that belongs to the man who had, by then, quietly abandoned any private hope of reaching Varsel Bay that season, and had begun instead to plan for a winter he had not intended to spend. What the ship became, in those months, was something without an easy name. She was no longer, in any working sense, a vessel. Her engines cold, her rudder locked in ice, her hull no longer subject to the sea's motion, but riding instead with the whole frozen plain around her. Drifting north and west at the pace the ice itself drifted, a few miles some days, none on others, occasionally backward when the wind turned against the current. She had become, in effect, a station, a fixed point of habitation set down upon a moving country of ice, her decks a street, her holds a cellar. The floes around her a dooryard where men walked the dogs and cut blocks of ice for melting into water. Worsley continued to take his sights when the sky permitted, plotting the ship's position day by day, not as a navigator plots a course, but as a man might track the slow crawl of a glacier, each fix a record of where the ice had chosen to carry them, rather than of anything the ship or her crew had chosen for themselves. The Endurance was, in that long polar dark, both prisoner and passenger, held fast by a force with no captain and no mercy, drifting steadily deeper into a winter that would, before it ended, ask more of the ship and of the men who lived upon her than any of them yet understood. The winter settled over the Endurance the way frost settles over a window, slowly and then completely, until there was no part of the ship or the men aboard her that it had not touched. The sun withdrew below the northern horizon in the last days of the Antarctic autumn, and for months afterward, the world existed in shades of grey and blue and black, lit only by moonlight on the ice, or the pale wash of the aurora moving overhead like something breathing. The temperature fell to depths that made metal burn the skin, and turned breath to frost on beards and blankets within minutes, and yet, within the wooden walls of the ship, a different sort of order took hold, one built not against the winter but around it, a fragile architecture of habit and routine, raised to hold back the pressing dark. Shackleton understood, perhaps better than any man aboard, that the greatest danger of the winter was not the cold itself, but the slow erosion of purpose that cold and darkness could bring to men confined together for months on end. And so he set about constructing a life aboard the frozen ship that had shape and rhythm, that gave each day a reason to rise and a reason to sleep, even when the sun offered no distinction between the two. The between-deck space, once used for stores, was cleared and converted into a common room the men called, with the dry humour that would carry them through much of what followed. The Ritz. Bunks were arranged along the walls. A stove was kept burning at its center, and it became the heart of the ship's waking life. The place where men gathered to eat, to talk, to read from the small collection of books they had carried south, and to endure the winter together, rather than each in his own private cold. The routines that Shackleton established were simple, almost domestic in their nature, and it was precisely their simplicity that gave them strength. Meals were taken at fixed hours, prepared with what care the stores allowed, and the taking of them was treated as an occasion rather than a mere necessity. There were watches to keep, dogs to feed, and the ship herself to maintain, her fires banked through the night, her hull inspected for the telltale signs of strain. Beyond these practical duties, Shackleton encouraged smaller rituals that had no purpose beyond the maintenance of spirit. There were Saturday nights when a tot of rum was issued, and toasts were drunk to sweethearts and wives. An old naval custom transplanted into the ice with quiet ceremony. There were birthdays marked with special meals scraped together from the diminishing stores, and there was, on one long dark evening, a concert of sorts. Men singing songs half remembered from homes that felt impossibly distant, their voices carrying oddly in the frozen air. The scientific work of the expedition did not cease simply because the ship had ceased to move. Hurley continued his photography, working in conditions that froze his plates and numbed his hands, capturing images of the ship locked in her white prison, the dogs curled in their kennels built out on the ice, the strange, sculptural forms the pressure ridges took as they rose and buckled around the hull. Meteorological observations were kept with the same discipline, as if the expedition's entire purpose had not already been diverted from its original aim. Temperatures recorded, wind directions logged, the long patient work of science continuing, even as the ship herself drifted farther from any shore where such data might ever be delivered. Worsley's navigational fixes, taken whenever the sky cleared enough to permit them, became almost a form of meditation, a way of marking that the days still passed. That time had not simply stopped along with the ship. The dogs, perhaps more than anything else aboard, gave the winter a texture of ordinary life. They had been brought south for the crossing of the continent that Shackleton had planned, and that the ice had now made impossible. And in the absence of that purpose, they became instead a kind of companionship, each dog named and known and cared for by the men assigned to its team. Igloos of snow were built for them out on the floe beside the ship, and the men took turns exercising them, racing them in makeshift competitions across the ice under the aurora. Wagers laid with tobacco and chocolate on which team would prove fastest. It was, in its way, an absurd scene. Grown men in the depth of an Antarctic winter, organizing dog races by moonlight. And yet it was precisely this kind of absurdity, deliberately cultivated, that kept the crew from sinking into the kind of despair that cold and darkness and uncertainty might otherwise have bred. Shackleton's leadership through these months was rarely loud. Those who left accounts of him during the winter drift describe not stirring speeches, but small, constant attentions. A word here, a gesture there. The placing of a struggling man in a role that restored his confidence. The sharing of his own cabin and stores with those who needed warming more than he did. He watched the men closely, noting who grew quiet, who grew short-tempered, who needed occupation rather than rest. And he adjusted the ship's small society accordingly, moving men between watches and tasks with a subtlety that few of them likely recognized as management at all. When morale flagged in one corner of the ship, a new project would somehow appear, a task requiring several hands and considerable talk, and the flagging would pass unnoticed into industry. It was leadership exercised in the manner of a man tending a fire through a long night. Not with grand gestures, but with constant small adjustments. Added fuel here, a shifted log there, keeping the flame alive without ever needing to remark upon the effort. But even as the men aboard maintained their small rituals and their careful order, the ship herself was speaking a different language, one that grew steadily harder to ignore. The pressure of the ice, which had closed around the Endurance in the autumn and carried her through the early winter in relative quiet, began by midwinter to make itself known through the hull in sounds the men had not heard before. At first it was a distant grinding, felt more than heard, a vibration that travelled up through the decks and into the bones of anyone standing still enough to notice it. Then it became audible, a groaning of timber under strain, the ship's frame protesting as the floes on either side of her shifted and pressed and occasionally released, only to press again from some new angle. Men who had served on other ships, who knew the ordinary sounds of a hull working in a seaway, said this was different. A deeper and more ominous note, the sound of wood being asked to bear a weight it had never been built to bear. The carpenter, McNish, and others who understood the ship's construction began to speak quietly of the strain being placed upon her, of timbers that had started to show the first hairline signs of stress, of a hull designed for the ordinary violence of storms and waves, now being asked to withstand something altogether more patient and more merciless. The slow and irresistible crush of a continent's worth of ice, pressing inward from every side. Shackleton, for his part, gave little outward sign of the concern this must have caused him, maintaining the same steady routines, the same small rituals of Saturday toasts and shared meals, even as he began quietly to have supplies and equipment moved to positions where they might be more easily retrieved should the worst come to pass. It was a preparation made without announcement, woven into the ordinary business of the ship so seamlessly that few of the men seemed to have marked it as anything unusual at the time. As the depth of winter began at last to loosen its grip, and the first pale suggestions of returning light appeared low on the horizon, a new tension entered the ship's life, one that ran beneath the surface of the same routines that had carried them through the darkest months. The turning of the season, welcome as it was after so long without the sun, brought with it a change in the ice itself. The floes that had held the Endurance in a kind of frozen truce through the deep winter began to feel the first stirrings of the spring's greater movement. Distant pressures travelling through the pack from storms and currents far beyond anything the men could see. And the ship's timbers answered with groans that came now, not occasionally but almost constantly, a low, continuous voice of strain that no one aboard could any longer pretend not to hear. By October, the pressure that had been a distant rumour through the pack ice became a fact pressing directly against the hull. The floes, which through the winter months had seemed to the men almost like solid ground, something fixed and dependable beneath their improvised routines, revealed themselves now as vast plates in slow and terrible motion, grinding against one another with a force that no timber, however thick, however carefully chosen and shaped by the yards of Sandefjord, could be expected to withstand indefinitely. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, recorded in his log the sounds that came up through the decks at all hours, a chorus of creaks and groans that rose and fell with the tides and the shifting of the floes, punctuated now by sharper reports, sudden cracks that ran through the ship like gunfire, and brought men up from their bunks with their hearts already racing before they had fully woken. The carpenter, Harry McNish, moved often along the lower decks with a lantern, checking the seams, noting where the oakum had begun to work loose, where new gaps had opened between planks that had held tight for months. His reports to Shackleton grew steadily less reassuring as October wore on. The men had long since ceased to speak of the ice as something separate from the ship's fate. They had watched it through the winter, learned its moods as sailors learn the moods of weather, and now they watched it with a different kind of attention. The attention of men who understood that the thing they observed might soon decide whether they lived or died. Pressure ridges rose along the floe edges nearest the ship, walls of broken ice thrust upward by the collision of one floe against another. And these ridges crept closer through the last weeks of October, narrowing the pool of open water that had briefly surrounded the Endurance during the short southern spring. The dogs, kept in their ice-built kennels at some distance from the ship, grew restless in ways the men had not seen before, and this restlessness was noted by several in the party as a kind of warning that needed no translation. On the 24th of October, the pressure reached the ship directly. The floes on either side closed against her flanks with a force that lifted her stern and canted her decks, and the sound that accompanied this movement was described by more than one man aboard as unlike anything they had heard before. A deep and resonant groaning that seemed to come from within the ship's very frame, rather than from the ice around her. As though the vessel herself were crying out under a weight she could no longer bear in silence. Water began to find its way into the bilges faster than the pumps, worked now in shifts around the clock, could remove it. Shackleton, who had, until this point, maintained in his diary and in his manner toward the crew a studied calm, began in these final days of October to record a growing certainty that the ship was doomed, though he continued to withhold this certainty from most of the men for as long as circumstances allowed him the choice. By the 27th of October, the choice was no longer his to make. The ice, in one sustained and merciless movement, closed upon the Endurance from both sides at once, and the pressure this time did not relent. Planks that had held through months of lesser strain gave way along the port side, opening a wound below the waterline through which the polar sea began to pour, in a volume the pumps could not answer. Shackleton gave the order that afternoon to abandon ship. It was delivered, according to those who recorded the moment, without drama, in the same measured tone he had used for lesser instructions throughout the expedition. Though the men understood from his face, if not from his words, the weight of what was being asked of them. What followed was carried out with a discipline that reflected the months of preparation and the temperament of the man who had shaped the expedition's character from its outset. Stores were brought up from the hold and set out upon the ice at a safe distance from the ship. Sledges loaded with tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and the carefully rationed food that would now have to sustain 28 men for a duration none of them could yet calculate. The 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancombe Wills, were hauled clear of their davits and dragged across the broken surface to a point judged solid enough to bear their weight. A labour that consumed the strength of every able man aboard and left them, by the time it was finished, too exhausted for anything but a brief and uneasy rest. Shackleton himself oversaw the removal of the ship's log, the chronometers, and a small number of personal items he permitted each man to keep, a limit he enforced with a firmness that some found difficult in the moment, but that later, in the long months that followed, was understood as a mercy, a decision made by a man already calculating the weight each sledge could bear across ice that might or might not hold. The camp established upon the floe, which the men came to call Ocean Camp, lay within sight of the ship, close enough that her outline remained visible against the pale sky through the days that followed. A constant and diminishing presence at the edge of their new and precarious life. Through the first days of November, the Endurance did not sink outright but settled instead by slow degrees, her masts leaning at angles that grew more pronounced with each passing day, her decks buckling upward in places where the pressure below had forced timbers past their limit. The men watched this process from their camp with an attention that mixed grief with a kind of clinical fascination. For many among them, sailors first and foremost, understood ships and could read in the Endurance's slow collapse a language of structural failure that carried its own grim eloquence. Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer, made what images he could during these final days, working with equipment ill-suited to the cold and the low light, preserving in a handful of frames the last visible posture of a ship that would soon exist only in memory and record. The masts came down first, one by one, brought low not by any single dramatic event, but by the accumulated strain of weeks, snapping finally under their own weight once the rigging that had held them upright gave way. The decks, which had once rung with the ordinary business of shipboard life, split open along seams that ice and pressure had widened past any hope of repair. And through these openings, the interior of the ship, the cabins and the galley, and the space that had briefly served as a photographic darkroom, became visible in fragments to those who watched from the ice. Glimpses of a world that had been home to them and was now being dismantled by forces beyond anyone's power to arrest. On the 21st of November, in the stillness of the early afternoon, the Endurance made her final movement. Those in camp who happened to be looking toward her at that moment saw her stern lift briefly, as though drawn upward by some hand beneath the ice, before the whole structure slid downward through the broken floe and disappeared beneath the surface, with a suddenness that contrasted sharply with the slowness of everything that had preceded it. The water that closed over her settled within moments into stillness, the floe reforming its surface as though no ship had ever rested there at all. Shackleton, who had watched the final descent from a short distance apart from the others, recorded that evening in his diary a brief and restrained account of what he had witnessed, noting the moment of her going down without embellishment, and adding only that he found it difficult, even then, to set down in words the full measure of what the sight had meant to him. He wrote, in words that would later be read by many who never set foot upon the ice, that she had gone at last, and that this was the end of the ship, though not, as the months ahead would prove, the end of the story that bore her name. What remained to the men, now that the ship herself had gone down into the dark water beneath the floe, was the ice itself, and it was upon this ice that they would build the next chapter of their survival, a chapter with none of the certainty that even a damaged hull might have offered. The camp they had occupied during the final days of the ship's slow collapse, and to which they now returned in earnest, they had already begun to call Ocean Camp, a name chosen for the wide and empty seascape that surrounded them on every side. Ice stretching to a horizon broken only by the distant blue shadows of pressure ridges, and, somewhere beneath it all, the black water that had swallowed their vessel. Here the tents were pitched again in careful rows, the sledges and boats drawn up nearby, and the business of organizing a life without walls began. Shackleton understood, perhaps before any of the others fully grasped it themselves, that the greatest danger to the party now lay not in the ice or the cold, but in the erosion of purpose, the slow dissolution of discipline and hope that could come from too many empty days spent waiting upon a floe that might, at any moment, decide to answer to forces none of them could see or predict. He therefore imposed upon the camp a structure of routines, watches and duties, small rituals that gave the shape of ordinary life to days that had, in truth, no ordinary shape at all. Food became, in these months, both a practical necessity and a kind of currency of morale, and the hunting of seals and penguins occupied a great deal of the party's waking attention. Craybeater and Weddell seals were taken when they could be found hauled out upon the ice, their meat providing not only sustenance for the men, but blubber for the primus stoves that boiled their meager stews and heated their tents against the encroaching cold. Penguins, when a rookery could be reached or a wandering bird approached the camp, were killed and butchered with the same grim efficiency, their meat proving, in the accounts left by several of the men, more palatable than that of the seals, though neither was ever mistaken by anyone for a delicacy. The keeping of these stores, the endless calculation of how much could be eaten today against how much must be preserved for the uncertain tomorrow, fell to those among the party skilled in such reckoning, and the ledger of rations became one of the great preoccupations of camp life, discussed and debated with an intensity that might, in another setting, have seemed disproportionate to its subject. but which here reflected the plain truth that upon these calculations rested the difference between survival and its opposite. Dogs, too, were eventually sacrificed to this same arithmetic, a decision recorded by several of the men with evident sorrow. For the animals had been companions as much as working beasts, and their loss was felt as something more than the loss of mere supplies. Beyond the physical labor of hunting and rationing lay a burden less visible, but in some ways heavier still. The psychological weight of open-ended waiting, of days accumulating into weeks and weeks into months, with no fixed date of deliverance and no certainty that deliverance would come at all. The floe upon which they camped was itself a kind of unwilling ship, carrying them northward at the mercy of currents and winds that no man could command, and the sensation of being borne along by forces entirely indifferent to their fate pressed upon the party in ways that the more concrete dangers of storm or cold did not. Diaries kept during these months, several of which survived the ordeal and were later published, reveal men grappling in different ways with this suspended condition, some finding solace in routine and small tasks, others recording longer stretches of low spirits, of irritability among companions confined too closely together for too long, of the particular exhaustion that comes not from labor, but from uncertainty itself. Shackleton's genius, if it may be called that, lay in his instinct for reading these currents of morale as keenly as he read the currents of the sea, and in intervening, often through small gestures, a shift in rations to mark some occasion, an exchange of banter, a reassignment of tents to separate men whose tempers had begun to fray against one another, before the accumulated strain could curdle into despair or discord that might threaten the party's cohesion. It was in this same spirit that small moments of humor and camaraderie were preserved, deliberately or not, in the diaries the men kept, moments that stand now as some of the most human fragments to survive the expedition. There are accounts of birthdays marked with whatever small luxuries remained, of mock ceremonies invented to mark the passage of some meaningless anniversary, of songs sung around the blubber stove in voices roughened by cold and salt air, of arguments over cards conducted with a seriousness wildly out of proportion to the stakes, since there was, after all, nothing else upon which to wager. Photographs taken by Frank Hurley during these months, developed under conditions that would have defeated a less resourceful man, capture faces that are, remarkably, often smiling. Men posed before their tents or beside a freshly killed seal, with an expression that suggests less the grim endurance one might expect, and more the particular good humor that arises among those who have accepted a hardship together and found, within it, a strange and durable fellowship. This is not to suggest that despair was absent, for it was not, and the diaries record its presence honestly, but rather that alongside the despair ran a countercurrent of resilience, of jokes exchanged in the coldest hours, of small kindnesses offered and received, that allowed the party to endure months upon the ice without the fracture of spirit that might, under lesser leadership or lesser luck, have proven as fatal as any physical peril. As the weeks passed, the camp was moved. Ocean Camp gave way eventually to what the men named Patience Camp, a name chosen with a certain rueful honesty for the quality it demanded of them above all others. As the ice beneath Ocean Camp grew unstable and the party was forced to relocate to a firmer floe further along their northward drift, Patience Camp would hold them through the heart of the ordeal, through the long, slow weeks in which the party's food supplies dwindled, in which the killing of the remaining dogs became a grim necessity rather than a difficult choice, and in which the ice itself, always the true master of their fate, continued its unhurried carriage of the party northward, following currents that would, if all went well, eventually bring them toward open water and the distant chance of reaching land. The drift was calculated and recalculated by the expedition's navigators using what instruments remained to them, and the men watched their position shift degree by degree, across charts that had once marked a route toward Antarctic exploration, and now marked instead a route toward mere survival. A return not to any destination they had planned, but simply toward water that a boat might cross. By the early spring of the southern hemisphere, the ice that had carried them so long began at last to show the signs of breaking that Shackleton and his officers had watched for with a mixture of hope and apprehension. For open water meant the possibility of reaching land, but it also meant the destruction of the platform upon which the party's entire camp and store of supplies depended. When the floe beneath Patience Camp at last split and grew too small and too unstable to support them further, the order was given to launch the 3 lifeboats that had been salvaged from the Endurance before her final descent. Boats that had been dragged across the ice for months, maintained and provisioned against precisely this eventuality, and which now became, in the most literal sense, the last resort standing between the party and the sea that surrounded them on every side. The men took to the boats amid ice that groaned and shifted beneath their feet, even as they loaded the final stores aboard, the floes themselves beginning to dissolve into the fractured pack that would, in the days ahead, force them into open water far more perilous than the ice had ever been, and toward a destination that none of them yet knew, though all understood it must be reached, if it was to be reached at all, by their own hands and by whatever endurance still remained within them. The 3 boats moved out into a sea that seemed to belong to no ordinary chart of the world. The Dudley Docker, the Stancomb Wills, and the James Caird, each laden past what their builders had likely intended, rose and fell upon swells that carried house-high walls of grey water beneath skies that offered little comfort and less warning. The men had spent nearly 500 days upon the ice, and now, in these frail, open craft, they found that the ice had perhaps been kinder than they had known. Waves broke over the gunwales with a regularity that kept bailing a constant task, hands numbed past feeling, wool and canvas soaked through and refusing, in that terrible cold, ever quite to dry. At night, the boats attempted to raft together, tied bow to stern, so that some measure of company might be kept against the dark, though the swell often tore the lines apart and left each boat to ride alone, until dawn revealed, with quiet relief, that the others had somehow survived the night as well. Ice remained a danger even in the open water, for the pack had not vanished so much as scattered, and floes drifted with the same swells that carried the boats, some small as tabletops, others vast as fields, all capable of crushing a hull that came upon them unprepared in the darkness. The men took turns at the tillers and at watch, eyes straining against salt spray and fading light for the pale gleam of ice ahead. And more than once a floe was avoided only by inches, by the shout of a lookout and the frantic pull of oars against a sea that seemed reluctant to yield even that much room. Thirst became, in these days, a torment perhaps worse than the cold. For the fresh water they had carried from the ice was limited, and the salt spray that coated every surface made what remained of their supplies taste faintly of the sea that surrounded them. A mockery of relief in a place with water on every side, and none of it fit to drink. Frank Worsley, navigating by sextant when the weather allowed him even brief sight of sun or star, guided the small flotilla with a precision that the accounts of the survivors would later credit as instrumental to their survival. For in that broken, shifting expanse of water, there was no landmark, no fixed point, nothing save calculation and the slow accumulation of dead reckoning to tell them whether they moved towards safety or only deeper into the waste. Elephant Island, a small and largely unknown outcrop of rock at the edge of the South Shetlands, became the object of their hope, chosen less for any particular promise it offered than for the fact that it existed at all, a piece of solid ground in a sea that had for so long denied them anything but ice and water. When the shore finally came into view, low and dark against the grey horizon, the response among the men, according to those who later gave account of it, was not the wild jubilation one might expect, but something quieter, almost disbelieving, a silence born of having hoped for so long that the hope itself had grown careful, unwilling to trust what the eyes reported, until the keel actually scraped upon the stones of the beach. It was the 7th of April, by the calendar the party had kept with such difficulty through the drift, though by now the days had blurred into a single continuous trial, and the crew, stepping down onto solid earth for the first time in 497 days, found that the ground itself seemed to move beneath them, a lingering sensation of the sea's motion that would not leave their legs for some time after, a strange and almost comic disorientation amid so much genuine relief. Elephant Island offered little beyond the bare fact of its solidity. The beach where they came ashore was narrow, exposed to wind and tide, backed by cliffs of ice and rock that rose steeply and offered no true shelter, and the men understood quickly that this small strip of stone could not be relied upon as a permanent refuge, that the sea itself might reclaim it at high tide or storm. A search along the coastline found a slightly better spit of land some miles distant, and the party moved again, the boats once more put to use for this shorter but still hazardous journey, until they reached a site that offered, if not comfort, at least a margin of safety from the tides that threatened the first beach. Here, at last, the men could rest upon ground that did not drift. Though the wind off the sea remained constant and fierce, and the island itself, so remote from any shipping lane or known route of vessels, offered no realistic hope that rescue might simply arrive on its own. Shackleton understood, in the days that followed the landing, that Elephant Island represented not an ending to the crisis, but merely a change in its nature. No ship came this way. No route of commerce or exploration passed near enough that a signal fire or a flag might draw attention. And the party, numbering 28 men in total, could not survive indefinitely on the seals and penguins that the island's shore provided, however grateful they were for that meat in the days immediately following their arrival. The decision that faced him was not whether to seek help, for there was no question of waiting passively for a rescue that had no means of finding them, but how such help might be sought across a sea that had nearly destroyed them already in far calmer conditions than what lay ahead. The plan that emerged, discussed among the party's officers in the days after landing, called for a voyage far beyond anything the small boats had yet attempted, a crossing of some 800 nautical miles of the most hostile ocean in the world, aimed at the whaling stations of South Georgia, the same island from which the expedition had departed the ice more than a year before. Of the 3 boats that had carried them from the pack, only the James Caird possessed the size and the seaworthiness that such a voyage demanded, and even she required extensive modification before Shackleton would trust her to the task. The ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, set to work raising her sides, building a makeshift deck from wood salvaged from the sledges and the remains of the other boats, sealing the seams with a mixture of oil paint and seal blood where proper materials could not be found, laboring in conditions of bitter cold to make the small craft into something that might, if fortune allowed, survive the Southern Ocean's worst. 6 men would make the voyage: Shackleton himself, Worsley as navigator, McNish, whose skill would be needed for any repair the boat required at sea, and 3 others chosen for their strength and their steadiness under hardship: Tom Crean, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy. The remaining 22 men would stay behind on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild, Shackleton's second, tasked with the grim patience of waiting, of surviving on what the island offered, of maintaining hope and order among a party that understood their survival, now depended entirely upon 6 companions crossing an ocean in an open boat scarcely 22 feet in length. The preparations for departure consumed the final days before the James Caird put to sea, her hold packed with what stores could be spared, her modified hull tested as best it could be against the surf that broke along the island's exposed shore. Wilde's party, in the meantime, began constructing what shelter they could from the two remaining boats, overturned and propped upon stone walls to form a low hut against the wind. A dwelling scarcely fit for the name, but the only protection the island would afford them, through what might prove a long and uncertain wait. The parting, when it came, carried the particular weight of an uncertainty neither side could voice easily, for the men remaining on the beach understood that their survival rested now on a voyage whose outcome none of them could know, while those departing carried with them the knowledge that 22 lives waited upon their success, a burden as heavy, in its way, as any wave the Southern Ocean might yet throw against their small and heavily laden boat. The James Caird was, by the ordinary measure of ships, scarcely worth the name at all. She was 22 feet and 6 inches from bow to stern, a ship's boat built for carrying men between shore and vessel, never intended for the open sea, let alone for the stretch of water she was now asked to cross. Yet it was in this small craft, decked over with canvas and packed with what stores and equipment could be spared, that 6 men set out from Elephant Island in April of 1916, bound for the whaling station at South Georgia, 800 nautical miles distant across some of the most violent water on Earth. The distance itself was the first fact to be reckoned with, for 800 miles in an open boat was a crossing that would have given pause to a far larger vessel, and there was no possibility of turning back, no shelter to be found along the way, no choice but to hold a course through whatever the Southern Ocean chose to send against them. The men who went were Shackleton himself, Frank Worsley as navigator, Tom Crean, and 3 others whose endurance had been proven through the long months on the ice. And each of them understood, without needing the fact spoken aloud, that failure meant not only their own deaths, but the deaths of the 22 men left behind on Elephant Island, who had no other hope of rescue and no means of reaching help themselves. The account of the voyage, as it survives in the records left by those who made it, describes conditions that seem, even in careful and restrained language, to press against the edge of what a small boat might endure and still remain afloat. The Southern Ocean at that latitude is a body of water with almost no land to break its waves, and the seas that built across its unbroken distances were of a size that a boat of 22 feet could do little but ride, rising with each swell and dropping into the trough behind it, again and again, for hour upon hour without relief. The men took turns at watch and at the pumps, for the boat shipped water constantly, and the cold was of a kind that soaked into clothing already stiffened with salt and never fully dried, so that the discomfort of the crossing was not a single hardship, but a continuous condition, sustained without pause across 16 days. Ice formed on the boat's timbers and rigging, adding weight that had to be chipped away by hand in the freezing air, a task performed while the boat pitched beneath them, for to leave the ice in place risked the boat riding too low and taking on water with each wave. There was little rest to be had, for the boat's interior offered no comfort, only a narrow space where men lay in wet sleeping bags among the ballast and stores. And the account left by those aboard makes clear that exhaustion became, by the later days of the voyage, as great a danger as the sea itself. Through all of this, it was Frank Worsley's navigation that held the small boat to its course, and the skill this required deserves to be understood plainly, for the conditions under which he worked would have made accurate navigation difficult, even for a man standing on a steady deck with clear skies above him. Worsley had almost none of these advantages. He took his sightings when the cloud broke for a moment, and the sun could be glimpsed, snatching the reading before the boat pitched again and the horizon vanished behind another wave. And he made his calculations crouched in the boat's small shelter, protecting his charts and instruments from the spray as best he could. The margin for error in such conditions was considerable, and the consequence of even a modest mistake was severe. for South Georgia was a small target across 800 miles of open water, and to miss it meant sailing on into empty ocean with no second landfall within reach. That Worsley brought the boat to within sight of the island's coast after 16 days. Guided by sightings taken under conditions that would have discouraged most navigators from attempting any calculation at all, stands as one of the notable feats of navigation recorded from the era, and it is remembered by historians of the voyage with the same quiet respect that the survivors themselves accorded it in their own accounts. The arrival, when it came, was not without its own final trial. For the coast of South Georgia that first came into view was not the side of the island where the whaling stations stood, but its wilder, unpopulated southern shore, a stretch of coastline the men had no choice but to approach, for the boat could no longer be kept at sea, its timbers strained and its crew reduced to the last of their strength. A gale nearly drove them onto the rocks before they found a way in, and the final approach to land was itself a moment of considerable danger, the boat threading a passage through surf and reef before at last coming to rest in a small cove, where the 6 men climbed onto solid ground for the first time in 16 days. The relief of solid earth beneath them was tempered immediately by the recognition that their landing place lay on the wrong side of the island entirely, separated from the whaling station at Stromness by a stretch of mountainous, uncharted interior that no one was known to have crossed. 2 of the men were too weakened to continue and were left in a makeshift shelter with what supplies could be spared, while Shackleton, Worsley and Crean set out to attempt what maps of the island did not even pretend to show a route across. The overland crossing of South Georgia has since been recognized as an achievement scarcely less remarkable than the boat voyage that preceded it. The 3 men had no proper mountaineering equipment, no tent, and only a short length of rope and a carpenter's adze in place of an ice axe. Yet they climbed through a landscape of glaciers, ridges and crevassed slopes that had never been mapped or crossed by any recorded party before them. They walked through a night and into the following day without rest, for to stop moving in such cold risked a sleep from which they might not wake, and at one point, faced with a slope too dangerous to descend by any careful method, they chose instead to slide down it together, roped as one, trusting to speed and momentum where caution offered no real advantage. The crossing took some 36 hours in all, undertaken by 3 men whose bodies had already been reduced by months of privation on the ice and by the 16 days just endured at sea, and it was completed without the loss of a single life, a fact that later students of the crossing have generally regarded as owing as much to sound judgment and endurance as to fortune. It was in the final hours of that crossing that the 3 men, descending at last toward the coast, heard the steam whistle of the whaling station at Stromness sound across the still air, a signal calling the station's workers to their day, and the sound told them, before they could see any building or any other sign of human presence, that they had found their way through. They reached the station in the early morning, filthy, bearded, and reduced almost beyond recognition as the kind of men who might present themselves at a working station's door, and the greeting that followed has been preserved in the accounts left by those present, remembered since for the restraint it carries within so extraordinary a moment. Shackleton, standing before the station manager who did not know him, is recorded as having said only, "Well, Mr. Searle, my name is Shackleton, and this is a moment I have long looked forward to." The line carries within it nothing of triumph or performance, only the plain fact of a name spoken by a man whom the manager had, by his own account, believed lost with all his party many months before. And it is this quiet exchange, understated and almost ordinary in its phrasing, that historians of the expedition have often singled out as the truest measure of the men who made the crossing. For it suggests that even at the end of so vast an ordeal, what remained was not spectacle, but simple, exhausted fact, delivered without embellishment, because none, after all that had passed, was needed. Yet the crossing of South Georgia, however celebrated it would later become, was only the resolution of one half of the expedition's peril. 22 men remained on Elephant Island, sheltering beneath 2 upturned boats on a spit of shingle so narrow and so exposed that even Wild, who commanded them in Shackleton's absence, had chosen it only because the alternatives were worse. Shackleton understood this with a clarity that seems to have steadied him, even as exhaustion pressed upon his body, and within hours of his arrival at the whaling station, freshly bathed and reclothed in borrowed garments, he was already turning his attention to the question of how a ship might be found to bring them off. The answer did not come quickly. The Southern Ocean in that season was thick with ice, and the vessels available at South Georgia were whaling ships built for calmer work, unsuited to the pack that lay between the island and Elephant Island's black cliffs. A first attempt was made aboard a whaler named Southern Sky, borrowed from the Norwegian whaling company with what generosity the war allowed. But the ice turned her back before she had gone far, her hull unequal to the pressure that had already destroyed a ship built with far greater care for exactly such conditions. Shackleton pressed the vessel as close as her master judged safe, and no closer, for he had learned upon endurance the cost of misjudging what ice could do to a wooden hull, and he would not risk another crew to save the first. The second attempt was made from the Falkland Islands, aboard a ship called Instituto de Pesca No. 1, provided by the government of Uruguay in one of the small acts of international goodwill that punctuated an otherwise indifferent wartime world. This vessel too was turned back by ice, her captain no more able than the last to force a passage where none existed. Each failure cost weeks, and each week, Shackleton understood, without needing to be told, was a further trial for the men waiting on the island, whose supplies had been calculated for a rescue that should, by any reasonable estimate, have already arrived. He wrote in this period of the difficulty of the delay, and those who observed him described a man whose outward composure did not waver, though the strain beneath it was evident to anyone who watched him pace the deck of whatever ship he had been lent, staring toward a horizon that would not yield. A third attempt was made in a chartered schooner named Emma, sailing from Punta Arenas in Chile with what assistance the Chilean government could provide, a nation not directly party to the war but sympathetic to the plight of stranded men regardless of their nationality. Once more the ice proved impassable, and once more the ship turned back, her engines unequal to the task, her hull too fragile to be risked further. By this point, months had passed since the Cairds crossing, and Shackleton's anxiety, though rarely expressed in the words he chose to record, can be inferred from the pace at which he moved from one attempt to the next, refusing the rest that his own body plainly required, driven by an urgency that had nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with the 22 men who remained, in his understanding, entirely dependent upon his persistence. The wider world, meanwhile, offered little assistance beyond what individual governments were willing to spare. The war that had begun as the Endurance sailed south had by now consumed the naval and merchant resources of the nations best equipped to send a proper rescue ship, and Shackleton found himself negotiating not with admiralties eager to assist a polar hero, but with harried officials for whom every vessel was already committed elsewhere. It was in this context of borrowed ships and diplomatic favors and repeated failure that the fourth attempt was finally made, aboard a small steam tug named Yelcho, lent by the Chilean Navy and captained by a Chilean officer named Luis Pardo, whose willingness to risk his ship and his career on a rescue that 3 previous vessels had failed to accomplish deserves to be remembered alongside the names more commonly attached to this story. Yelcho sailed from Punta Arenas in August of 1916, more than 4 months after Shackleton had first reached South Georgia, and this time the ice, whether through fortune or through a narrow window in the pack that the earlier attempts had not found, permitted a passage. As the tug approached Elephant Island, Shackleton stood at the rail with a pair of binoculars, counting the figures that emerged upon the shore. And it was wild, watching for a rescue that had been so many times promised and so many times denied, who first made out the ship approaching, and later accounts describe the men on the beach counting heads aboard the small vessel with the same anxious arithmetic Shackleton had once performed. Watching for his own crew, uncertain until the boat drew near whether it carried salvation or only another disappointment. It did not disappoint. All 22 men who had waited beneath the upturned boats were found alive, thin and weathered by months of confinement and privation, but alive, every one of them, a fact that has been noted by historians of the expedition with something closer to disbelief than celebration, given how narrow the margins had been at every stage of the ordeal. From the ice that crushed the ship, to the boat voyage across the Southern Ocean to the crossing of South Georgia's mountains, any one of which might reasonably have claimed a life or several. The moment of rescue itself, as recorded by those present, carried little of the drama that later retellings would sometimes lend it. There was no triumphant address, no speech marking the end of the ordeal. Shackleton came ashore, counted his men, and asked, according to the accounts that survive, only whether all were well, and upon being told that they were, seems to have said little more. The relief too large, perhaps, for easy expression, or perhaps simply exhausted, past the point where words carried much weight. The return to a world beyond the ice brought its own quiet disorientation. The men of the Endurance had sailed south in 1914 from a world at peace, or at least a world that believed itself so, and they returned in 1916 to a conflict that had by then consumed a generation of young men across Europe. A war whose scale and horror none of them could have anticipated when they set out. Several of the crew, upon reaching civilization, enlisted almost immediately, exchanging one theater of extremity for another, and at least a few of Endurance's company would not survive the fighting that followed, a fact that lends a further, darker layer to a story already heavy with loss. For the ship that failed to complete its transcontinental crossing produced no deaths among its own company, and yet the war beyond the ice would claim some of the same men who had endured the pack and the boat journey and the mountains of South Georgia without harm. It is this peculiar shape of the expedition's legacy that historians have found most difficult to categorize, for by the measure Shackleton had set for himself, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition was an unambiguous failure. The continent was not crossed. The scientific and geographic ambitions announced with such confidence before the ship sailed were abandoned entirely once the ice closed around her hull. And yet the expedition is remembered not for what it failed to achieve, but for what it managed to preserve. A story told and retold, not as an account of exploration accomplished, but as an account of survival against odds that by any ordinary reckoning should not have permitted it. The ship was lost. The mission was not completed. And still, every man who had sailed upon her came home. And it is this fact, more than any other, that has given the voyage of Endurance its enduring and somewhat paradoxical place in the history of polar exploration. A failure remembered not for what was lost, but for everything that, against every expectation, was not. The Endurance drifted downward into the Weddell Sea in the closing weeks of November 1915, and for more than a century afterward, no human eye would look upon her again. She settled somewhere beneath thousands of feet of freezing water, in a stretch of oceans so remote, so choked with ice for most of the year, that the very idea of returning to find her seemed, for generations, closer to fantasy than to any achievable expedition. She passed, in the years that followed her sinking, from a ship that men had lived and worked and nearly died upon into something more abstract. A name in books, a subject of paintings, a wreck whose precise position existed only as a set of figures in a logbook, carried home by the men who had survived her loss, and repeated in the retelling until the story of her sinking became more familiar to the world than the ship herself had ever been. It is worth pausing here to set the Endurance within the wider company of vessels built to meet the world's harshest waters. For she was neither the first nor the last ship to test herself against ice, and the fascination she inspires belongs to a much older human preoccupation. Ships had been sailing toward the poles for centuries by the time Endurance was laid down, each one shaped by the same essential problem: how to build a hull that could meet ice without yielding to it entirely. The whaling ships of the Arctic, reinforced with additional planking and iron sheathing, had ventured into pack ice long before any expedition of purely scientific or exploratory purpose set out to do the same. Vessels such as Fram, built at the end of the 19th century for Fridtjof Nansen's Arctic drift, had been designed on the deliberate principle that a ship trapped in ice should not resist the pressure by standing rigid against it, but should instead be shaped so that the ice, pressing inward, would lift the hull upward and out of the grip of the floes rather than crush it. Fram succeeded in this design where Endurance, built to a different purpose and a different hull form, ultimately did not. Other ships, too, had gone before her into these waters and returned, or had not returned at all, their wrecks scattered across the historical record of polar ambition, a long chronicle of wood and iron tested against a force that no vessel, however carefully built, could be entirely certain of surviving. Endurance belongs to this lineage, one part of a much longer human effort to build ships capable of enduring what the ice would ask of them, and her sinking, however dramatic in its particulars, was not without precedent among the vessels that had attempted the same passage into extreme waters before her. What set her apart from many of these other ships, and what would in time draw explorers and historians back to her more than a century after her loss, was the completeness of the story that survived her. The accounts, the photographs, the diaries, and above all the careful figures recorded by her navigating officer in the final days before she was abandoned. It was this navigational record, more than any other single document, that would make the eventual search for the wreck possible at all, and it deserves to be understood clearly. For without it, the ship might have remained not merely lost, but unfindable, her position a matter of guesswork rather than calculation. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain and her navigator, had continued to take careful sightings of the sun and stars throughout the long months of the drift, long after any hope of steering the ship remained, and had continued this practice even as the ice closed around the hull, and even in the final days before she was crushed and sank beneath the floes. It would have been easy, amid the slow catastrophe of the ship's destruction, for such careful record-keeping to lapse, for the ordinary discipline of navigation to seem, in the face of the ship's death, a pointless exercise. Worsley did not allow it to lapse. He continued to take his sightings with the same precision he had brought to the task in calmer waters, working with a sextant and the tables available to him, calculating the ship's position by the same slow, exacting method used by navigators for centuries before the invention of any more modern means of fixing a vessel's place upon the sea. When Endurance finally went down, on the 5th day of a Weddell Sea winter that showed no signs of yielding, and the men who had lived aboard her these many months stood upon the ice and watched her disappear, Worsley had already recorded, with as much accuracy as the instruments and conditions allowed, the coordinates of the place where she sank. This log, carried through the months that followed on the ice, through the desperate boat journey to Elephant Island, and eventually across the Southern Ocean and back to the world beyond, became in time the single thread connecting the ship's final resting place to any hope of future discovery. It was not a perfect record. The instruments of the day, the difficulty of taking accurate sightings amid drifting pack ice and uncertain weather, and the passage of the ship itself across the ice before her. Sinking all introduced a margin of uncertainty into the position Worsley had calculated. A margin that would prove, in later decades, to be the central difficulty facing anyone who wished to locate the wreck. But the position existed, committed to paper by a man who understood, even amid the wreck of the expedition's larger ambitions, that this particular task could not be permitted to fail. For decades after the survivors returned to a world already consumed by a war of its own, no attempt was made to locate the wreck. The technology required to search for a vessel resting at such depth, beneath such a hostile and ice-choked stretch of ocean, simply did not exist, and even had it existed, the resources and appetite for such a search were, for many years, nowhere to be found. The story of endurance settled instead into the realm of memory and record, told through the survivors' own accounts, through Worsley's later writings, through the photographs taken by the expedition's photographer, which remain among the most remarkable visual records of any polar expedition of the era. The ship herself became, in this period, less a wreck to be found than a legend to be repeated. Her position known only in the abstract, a set of coordinates in an old log that few imagined would ever be tested against the reality of the seafloor. It was not until later in the 20th century, as underwater search technology slowly developed and as interest in historic shipwrecks grew into something resembling a discipline of its own, that the idea of searching for endurance began to seem less impossible. Early conversations about a possible expedition to locate the wreck surfaced from time to time, prompted by anniversaries of the expedition or by advances in sonar and submersible technology that had, by then, located other famous wrecks once thought unreachable. But the particular conditions of the Weddell Sea, the same conditions that had trapped and crushed the ship in the first place, continued to present an obstacle that dwarfed the ambitions of any early proposal. Pack ice in this region remained thick, unpredictable, and dangerous to any vessel attempting to linger in the area long enough to conduct a methodical search, and the depth at which the wreck was believed to lie, combined with the uncertainty inherent in Worsley's decades-old calculations, meant that any search would require not only ice-capable vessels, but underwater equipment capable of operating at extreme depth across an area of seafloor whose exact boundaries could only be estimated. Several early attempts to organize expeditions toward this end faltered before they could be properly mounted, undone by the combination of expense, technical difficulty, and the sheer inhospitality of the region in which the wreck was believed to rest. It became, for a time, almost an article of faith among those who followed the story that endurance might never be found at all, that she would remain, like so many other wrecks scattered across the world's oceans, a ship whose fate was known in its broad outline, but whose precise resting place would never be confirmed. And yet the story persisted, carried forward by each new generation that encountered the account of the expedition, by historians who continued to examine Worsley's log and the surviving records with fresh attention, and by an enduring public fascination with a ship that had been so thoroughly documented in her final months and so thoroughly lost in the century that followed. The pieces necessary for an eventual search remained in place, waiting, the coordinates recorded by a careful navigator on a sinking ship, the growing capability of modern search technology, and a persistent, quiet interest that refused, across all those decades, to let the story of endurance fade entirely into the realm of legend alone. A century after the ship had gone down, the pieces that had waited so long finally came together. In the year 2021, an expedition was organized under the name Endurance 22. Its purpose stated plainly and without exaggeration: to locate and survey the wreck of Shackleton's ship, to document her condition using the most careful methods available, and to do so without disturbing her resting place. The expedition was led by the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, and it drew together a team that included marine archaeologists, historians, ice pilots, and technicians skilled in the operation of underwater search equipment. Among those aboard were relatives of men who had sailed with Shackleton, descendants who carried forward, in their own presence on the deck of a modern icebreaker, a connection to the crew of the original Endurance. Their inclusion was not treated as sentiment alone. It was regarded by the organizers as a fitting acknowledgement that the story being pursued was not simply a matter of engineering and coordinates, but one that belonged in some measure to the families who had carried its memory forward across generations. The ship chosen for the expedition was the South African polar vessel Agulhas II, a research and supply icebreaker built for exactly the kind of conditions the Weddell Sea was known to present. She carried aboard her a suite of technology that would have seemed impossible to imagine in the age of Shackleton's voyage. Autonomous underwater vehicles capable of descending thousands of meters below the surface, operating independently of any tether, and returning with detailed sonar images of the seabed below. These vehicles, known by the acronym AUVs, were designed to travel in careful, methodical patterns across a designated search area, sweeping the ocean floor with sonar in overlapping passes, building up a picture of the terrain meter by meter. The technology was new enough that its use in a search of this kind, in waters as unpredictable as the Weddell Sea, was itself a considerable undertaking, requiring specialists who understood both the vehicles and the particular hazards of the ice above them. The search area itself was defined, in the end, by a single set of numbers recorded more than a century before. Frank Worsley, the navigator whose skill had guided the James Caird across 800 miles of open ocean, had also taken the position of the ship at the moment of her sinking, calculating it by the methods available to him and recording it carefully in his log. It was this position, refined and cross-checked by later historians and navigators using an understanding of ocean currents and ice drift that Worsley himself could not have possessed, that gave the Endurance 22 expedition its starting point. The team narrowed the position further, using knowledge of how the ice pack itself had likely moved in the days after the ship went down. Since Endurance had not sunk instantly beneath the exact point of the log entry, but had settled through the water and drifted somewhat as she fell, carried by currents unseen from above. The resulting search area was smaller than it might have been in an earlier decade, thanks to layers of calculation added across 100 years. But it remained a stretch of seabed measured in hundreds of square kilometers, lying beneath ice that made every day of searching uncertain. The tension of the search became, in its own quiet way, a kind of echo of the tension the original crew had endured. The Weddell Sea in the modern era remained what it had always been, an unforgiving expanse of moving pack ice, prone to closing over open water within hours, capable of trapping even a vessel as capable as Agulhas II if she lingered too long in the wrong place. The expedition's ice pilots watched the floes with the same wary attention that Frank Worsley and Frank Wild had once given them, aware that a modern ship, however reinforced, was not immune to the pressures that had crushed Endurance a century before. Days were lost to weather. The autonomous vehicles, for all their sophistication, required careful deployment and recovery through narrow leads in the ice, and on more than one occasion, a vehicle was lost briefly beneath the pack, requiring anxious hours of searching before it was recovered. One vehicle was lost entirely partway through the expedition, an incident that cost the team valuable search time and required a recalibration of their approach. Weeks passed in this manner, the ship holding her position as best she could against the drift of the ice, the AUVs descending again and again into the cold darkness below, each mission adding a portion of new seabed to the survey, and each portion, for a long while, revealing nothing but empty mud and stone. The patience required was considerable, and it was not evenly rewarded. There were days when equipment failures halted the search entirely, and days when the ice closed in around the ship so thoroughly that the crew turned their attention from the sonar screens to the more immediate question of the vessel's own safety. Members of the expedition later described the particular strain of searching for something so significant in conditions that offered no guarantee of success at all, aware that an expedition of this scale and cost might conclude, as earlier search efforts had concluded, without finding anything. The wreck could have drifted from the position Worsley recorded. It could have been damaged beyond recognition by a century of pressure and current. It could simply have been buried over the decades beneath layers of sediment that no sonar pass would penetrate. Every possibility remained open until the moment it was closed. That moment came on the 5th of March in the year 2022, an autonomous vehicle descending through the dark water on yet another methodical pass, returned images that resolved, this time, into an unmistakable shape. A hull, upright, largely intact, resting on the seabed at a depth of just over 3,000 meters. Within 4 miles of the position Worsley had recorded more than 100 years before. The accuracy of that century-old navigation, achieved without satellites, without modern instruments, using only the careful application of dead reckoning and the observations a skilled seaman could take from a deck surrounded by ice, was itself remarked upon by those aboard Ogulhas II as a quiet marvel in its own right. What the sonar and subsequent camera passes revealed was a wreck in a condition that few aboard had allowed themselves to expect. The masts had gone, broken away during the sinking or lost to the century that followed, but the hull itself stood largely whole, its timbers holding their shape, its deck structures recognizable, its stern rising from the seabed in a manner that allowed the ship's identity to be confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. There, across the stern, in letters that a century of cold water had left legible, was the ship's name, Endurance. Beneath it, the 5-pointed star that Shackleton had chosen as part of her identity, unchanged since the day she had been rechristened in Norway. The marine archaeologists aboard, reviewing the footage as it came in, described their reaction in terms that avoided exaggeration and leaned instead toward a kind of quiet disbelief. They had hoped to find the wreck. They had not necessarily expected to find her so whole. The explanation for her extraordinary state of preservation lay, they concluded, in the very conditions that had made the Weddell Sea such a dangerous place for the ship in life. Water so cold and so poor in oxygen that the wood-boring organisms responsible for consuming most shipwrecks in warmer seas could not survive there at all. Without those organisms at work, the timbers of Endurance had been left largely undisturbed across 100 years, protected by the same icy, hostile environment that had doomed her. It was, several of those present observed, a strange kind of justice. The sea that had crushed the ship had also, in its way, preserved her, holding her intact and legible at the bottom of the world, until a search built on faith in an old navigator's numbers finally found her waiting there. So the ship remained where she had fallen, and where she remains still. In the years following her discovery, the wreck of Endurance was designated a protected historic site and monument under the Antarctic Treaty, a status that placed her beyond the reach of salvage, of souvenir, of any hand that might wish to raise a timber or lift the bell from her deck for display in some distant museum. Those who found her, and the governments and institutions who stood behind the search, agreed without much argument that she should stay exactly as she lay. There would be no attempt to bring her up, no effort to preserve her in the way that other famous wrecks had sometimes been preserved, dried and reassembled and lit under gallery lamps for visitors to walk around. Endurance would remain in the place where the ice had left her, 3,000 meters down, in the cold and the dark and the crushing pressure of the Weddell Sea, visited only by the quiet machines that had found her, and by whatever expeditions might, in careful and regulated fashion, come after. It was a decision made not reluctantly, but with something closer to relief. The ship had a resting place. It seemed right that she should be allowed to keep it. There is a certain meditation available to anyone who considers the fate of that ship for long enough, and it turns on the matter of what she was built to do and what, in the end, was done to her. Endurance had been constructed, from her earliest days as Polaris, with the specific and considerable purpose of resisting ice. Her hull had been shaped and reinforced for exactly this task, her frames set closer together than convention required. Her timbers chosen and layered and doubled precisely, so that she might meet the pressure of a frozen sea and hold her shape against it. She was, by the standards of her age, among the strongest wooden ships ever built for polar work. A vessel designed from keel to rail with ice in mind. Ice as the anticipated enemy. Ice as the condition she had been engineered from the outset to survive. And it was ice, in the end, that took her. Not a storm, not a reef, not the ordinary hazards that claimed so many ships of her era, but the very substance she had been built to withstand, closing around her with a patience no design could fully anticipate, squeezing until even her doubled timbers gave way. There is something in that meeting of ambition and nature that resists easy summary. It was not a failure of craftsmanship. The men who built her had done their work well, and the ship had done what ships of her kind were meant to do for as long as any wooden vessel reasonably could. But the Weddell Sea, in the end, was patient in a way that no hull, however carefully built, could out-endure. The ice did not attack her so much as it simply continued, indifferent to the intentions of her builders, indifferent to the name she carried, indifferent to whatever meaning human beings might wish to assign to the contest between a ship and a sea. It closed, and closed further, and in time the wood could bear no more. This was not defeat in any dramatic sense, not a battle lost through error or misfortune, but something closer to a natural conclusion reached between two forces operating according to their own patient laws. The ship endured for as long as endurance was possible. Then she did not, and the sea took her, gently in the way of deep water, down through cold and dark to a floor where no light had ever properly reached, and there she came finally to rest. It is worth pausing, too, on the strange grace of how she came to be found again. A century had passed. The men who had walked her decks, who had felt her ribs give way beneath their boots, who had watched her masts go down into the ice at last, were long since gone. Their own lives concluded decades before any search vessel set out to look for her, and yet the ship was found, in the end, not through some accident of chance or the sweep of a wandering current, but through the patient application of exactly the kind of measurement and calculation that her own captain had practiced aboard her. Frank Worsley's sightings, taken through cloud and uncertain weather with instruments that offered no guarantee of precision, had been carried forward across 100 years and matched, near enough, by modern positioning systems and searching technology that could not have been imagined in his lifetime. There is something almost tender in that connection, the meeting of an old navigator's careful arithmetic with the sonar and submersibles of a later age, as though the intervening century had simply been a long pause in a single unbroken effort to locate one ship on one particular stretch of ocean floor. The search that found her was built, in the most literal sense, on faith in numbers written down by a man who could not have known whether anyone would ever attempt to use them, and who certainly could not have imagined the tools that would eventually make his sightings useful again. When the wreck appeared at last on the screens of the search vessel, intact and recognizable in a way that startled even those who had studied her for years, it was as if, two very different eras of exploration had reached toward each other across 100 years of ice and silence and, however briefly, touched. The image that remains after all of this is a quiet one, down in that cold water, where no sunlight has ever penetrated and where the pressure would crush an unprotected diver in moments. The ship's wheel still stands at her stern, its spokes worn smooth by hands that gripped it through storms and calm alike. Through the long, grinding months of the drift and the final terrible hours when the ice closed in. Nearby, still legible after a century in the dark, the name Endurance remains fixed to her stern rail, the letters spelling out both the ship's identity and, in a way that feels almost too fitting to be accidental, the very quality her crew would need most in the months that followed her loss. The wheel does not turn. No hand rests upon it now. The name does not fade because there is nothing in that deep, cold, oxygen-starved water to make it fade. No current strong enough to disturb it. No creature patient enough to consume it. No light to bleach it pale. It simply remains, exactly as it was left, waiting in a stillness so complete that a century of tides has made no visible mark upon it. Photographs taken by the search team show that nameplate clearly, its letters catching the beam of an artificial light in a place where no light had ever properly belonged. And there is something in that image, more than in any other detail of the story, that seems to hold the whole of it together. The ship endured what it could, then it did not, and now it remains indefinitely in the dark, watched over by an agreement among nations that it should be left exactly as it is, a monument to a voyage that ended in failure and somehow became, across the century that followed, one of the most admired stories of survival that the age of polar exploration ever produced. There are many such ships, resting in many such places, each carrying its own long history of ambition and labor and the particular meeting of human effort with the patient, in different forces of wind and water and ice. Endurance is only one among them, though her story has traveled further than most, carried forward by the boat journeys and the winter camps and the long walk across South Georgia that followed her loss, and carried further still by her strange and quiet rediscovery a century later. For those who wish to sit with more of these stories, more ships built in hope and lost in patience, more voyages that ended at the bottom of the sea and were found again, by those willing to look carefully and wait, there are further chronicles waiting on this channel, each offered in the same unhurried way, each resting, as this one has, on what the record allows and no further. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with the Endurance, and with the ice that took her and kept her, and, in its own strange season, let her be found again.